we will do the land acknowledgement that describes Toronto as in the dish with one spoon territory. And it's the treaty between the Anishinaabe, the Mississaugas, and the Haudenosaunee that bound them together to share the territory and protect the land. And subsequent indigenous nations and peoples, Europeans and newcomers, have been invited into that treaty in the spirit of peace, friendship, and respect. And while has become ubiquitous, we really do believe as a club that it's very important to remind ourselves of this history.
Dr. Jaccard has a very long list of accomplishments, and it's not possible to do them justice without going on too long. So I'm not even going to try, except to say that for an internationally respected economist and an expert on climate change, he has taken some surprising steps. For example, he's not beyond getting outside his comfort zone to stop a coal train, for which he was arrested. And he's passionate about his message. Why else would he get up at a crazy early hour to talk to us from BC? We think it's terrific. He has some critical messages that we need to hear. Among them, one that resonated for me is that committed citizens can make a difference, particularly when they're armed with knowledge about how to tackle climate change effectively. So I have a warning for everyone. This talk may provoke an uncomfortable urge to take more action. It certainly did when I read his book for me. So without further ado, over to you, Mark.
So what is the goal of my book? Well, it's to help climate concerned citizens, and thank you for that good introduction. You've helped. It's detect deliberate delusions and inadvertent myths. There's a difference there, deliberate versus accidental or unconscious. Elect climate sincere politicians who do effective policy and even eliminate our personal emissions very simply with a couple of fuel switching actions. So a couple of key terms there, climate concerned citizens. So not everyone has to be climate concerned for us to succeed. Climate sincere politicians, they're not all climate sincere. Now I want to start out though, and that's the big theme of the book after me working in this area and us policy analysts telling politicians for 3 decades now, here's what you have to implement with this issue. And then me starting to say, does it really help if I'm part of teams of researchers that are saying the same thing over and over again, or should I be looking behind the screen to humans and human collective decision-making, individual decision-making? And it brought me into the literature where I'm just an amateur reader of human psychology. And so I don't purport to have great expertise, but there's some pretty obvious things that come out in the literature. And I'm going to show that with a couple of quotes. One is Upton Sinclair, American writer and politician from 100 years ago. It's difficult to get someone to understand something when their salary depends on them not understanding it. And a quote from Bertrand Russell, the British philosopher of 100 years ago, what someone believes on grossly insufficient evidence is an index into their desires. So I have a distinction here, right? The first one is really about your own personal financial self-interest. And the second one is more about how you'd like to see the world. And I can't spend a lot of time in a short talk like this but I want to emphasize in these opening slides and comments just how important I see this. And I hope you pick up on this and apply it back to yourself as we get into some of the later issues in my talk. And I'm going to use one slide to kind of explain that. I teach a graduate seminar. It's actually when it's at my house, this is a few years, this is pre-COVID. Some of the meetings are at universities, some are right here in the room behind you. And one of the first things I do with the students, these are graduate students from the University of British Columbia and Simon Fraser University. They're very talented. And I get them to argue about something, biofuels. Give your position on biofuels. Should we do biofuels? And then they make a really cogent argument. We shouldn't do biofuels, or we should do biofuels. Then I tell them, when you went to school, maybe you formed debate teams and we thought we were helping you to become good debaters, but we actually want you to become good critical thinkers and self-critical thinkers. So instead, now I want you to argue the exact opposite of your initial position. And it is shocking how bad they are. And they start to see that. They actually have never tried to understand the very best arguments that are counter to what they believe. And it's often at a very primitive level. So we go through this exercise again and again in that first class, and we do it throughout the semester. If you're going to believe in something, you better know the very best opposite arguments. But humans don't do that. We have a tendency to think like lawyers. What are all the best arguments that back what I believe, rather than understanding the counter arguments? The counter arguments, knowing both, doesn't mean that you'll be paralyzed, but it will mean that sometimes you're willing to say, I'm not sure, or maybe this biofuels applies here and might be okay, but it won't be able to do all of this. And it depends how we do it. You might end up being a little more careful and qualified. And as you'll see in the later slides, that might be helpful. Now, what I'm going to do now is talk about how this critical thinking among climate experts can lead us to some real simplification of the challenge ahead of us, the simple necessity of decarbonization. Right? So what do we have to do? We have to stop burning coal, oil, and natural gas. And if we look at the evidence that is sort of clearly agreed to by experts, there are three things that we need to think about. The first is the myth that fossil fuels are expensive, right? So you're hearing about this. Fossil fuels are expensive. Renewables will be cheaper. Let's just get energy efficiency is cheaper. But that's not true. The evidence is that fossil fuels are plentiful, they're high quality, and they're low cost. And their price keeps falling with innovation. It's been doing that for decades. It might jump up sometimes because of global geopolitical crises, but the price in real terms keeps falling. And as we try to switch away from burning fossil fuels, that'll decrease their demand and the price will fall even more. And so because of that, if you were today in Vietnam or Pakistan, Bangladesh, in countries that comprise at least 5 billion people on this planet, burning fossil fuels to make electricity, to run your transport system, to run your major industries is still your cheapest option for development. And that means to follow the development path that China followed from 1990 to 2015. And we all know the story of how its emissions went up. Well, this is still what the developing world is looking at. And the growth in emissions, the developing world, when we include China as well, but not, it's China as part of the developing world, those emissions are forecast to keep rising, and I'll come back to that. The second myth is we keep having meetings every year in which we try to voluntarily agree on the allocation of the burden of decarbonizing the entire global system, right? So of course, this is a global problem, so it requires a united international effort, but we don't have global governance mechanisms, and rich and poor countries disagree on the sharing of the costs. So every year they come together in a conference, and the rich countries do say, oh yeah, you're right, we have to pay you some for this, and the poor countries say, yeah, otherwise we should build coal plants, we should use oil-based diesel to run our trucking system, and the rich countries say, here's the amount of money we can give, and of course it's 1/1000th of what is needed, and it will always be that way. The amount of transfer of wealth for poor countries to walk away from fossil fuel burning is enormous. It means we'd have to shut down a lot of things, and quite frankly, us and our fellow citizens are a little too selfish for that. And therefore, and a cartoonist has done some black humor about this, every year we do this crazy dance where we have a meeting, and of course we write illustrious sentences after it about what we've agreed on, but in fact we don't have agreement, and we won't as long as we're trying to do it as a voluntary global agreement. The third myth, and the third and final one, is the myth of honest domestic policy debate. Okay, now I don't have to say much about that these days. I mean, I wrote these parts of the book with my students 8, 9 years ago. I mean, it's chapters that I put together over the years. So if we have climate sincere politicians, their task is very difficult because, as you know, fossil fuels are incumbent. And so that financial self-interest motivates corporations and individuals to trumpet the benefits from their continued use. And climate insincere politicians can fake it because we're trying to do a major multi-decade transformation. That's what decarbonization is. And so it's easy to say, oh, I've got to target 15 years 30 years from now. So I'm sincere and yet actually implement none of the policies that would cause that decarbonization. And it's even worse. The climate insincere politicians can lie about the economic harm from effective policies and exploit things like the anti-tax bias of some percentage of voters. And it doesn't have to be a lot of voters. It only has to be a small percentage in swing ridings, in the 905, thinking about who my audience is here, what determines Canadian elections so often. So there's those three myths. These can make decarbonization paths seem complicated. And I've got a quote here. I could have found this anywhere. As soon as I decided I better put a quote like this in here, because I read them all the time, I found it right away. This one, so I'm picking on poor Lisa's song of ProPublica, but anyone, you see this all the time. Fossil fuels are so integrated into our lives that phasing them out would require us to change everything about how and where we live, how we get around, and how we make money. So do you think that's true? It's completely not true. And I explain why this assumed complexity is both wrong and a key reason for our climate failure thus far. So first, though, I'm going to tell you what that simple path is and why it's simple. And then I'm going to explain how we've obfuscated and complicated that and what kinds of reasons for which we've done that. So what are the key actions? I've already said it. Phase out the burning of coal, oil, and most uses of natural gas. And we have countries that are doing coal phase outs, including Canada, and countries that are phasing out gasoline, including Norway, China, and hopefully Canada. The other thing is that simple path in your own country is especially to work on electricity and transportation, because we already know how to get to zero emission electricity and zero emission transportation, and we have the technologies and these costs. It's not free because fossil fuels are so cheap, and such an effective form of energy. So moving away from them has a cost, but they're modest in those two sectors. And also, it's easier because these are domestic sectors. They're less vulnerable as opposed to us acting in our trade exposed major emission intensive industries like steel, cement, aluminum, chemicals, and pulp and paper, where if we act, we raise the cost of production in these sectors, and then they're in trouble in terms of competition from equivalent steel plants in laggard countries that are not implementing stringent climate policy. And then finally, the important thing about these two sectors is they actually account for more than 50% of future greenhouse gas emissions. So you succeed there and you're already halfway home. And so this slide shows this. Now I just have to explain it for a second. The two pies represent what emissions of energy-related greenhouse gases will be we call it a reference case. It just means if humanity heads on the same path it is right now, where it's making some progress, but emissions are still rising. And I took this, there are so many different, there's the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and other entities that do these forecasts, and a lot of them are quite similar for the year 2050. What you see is that the pie is larger for the developing countries, non-OECD, whereas it's smaller for the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, because emissions are not rising now in most OECD countries. But look at transportation and electricity. Just those two sectors account together for more than 50% of those expected emissions. So that's an important thing to keep in mind when you kind of despair, like, oh, these emissions from all these sources. It's actually not that complicated. And so the first part was, where are the actions? And I have decarbonization actions in red is what we just talked about. But those things don't happen because fossil fuels are so cheap unless we have policies that are compulsory, which means pricing and or regulation. Now this schema is a way of simplifying this. Climate energy policy, first I'm branching it into non-compulsory and compulsory. And the non-compulsory are, it's what the Brian Mulroney government and the Jean Chrétien governments mostly did when they were trying to act on climate, like the Rick Mercer commercials, a voluntary challenge for industry, the voluntary challenge registry, information programs, labels, some subsidies. We know because fossil fuels are so cheap that Governments are only sincere when they're also in, to a significant way, the compulsory category. And they have options there. They can do carbon pricing, they can do regulations, they can do combination. And when they're in carbon pricing, they can do a carbon tax like British Columbia, and now the backstop that our federal government is putting for laggard provinces, or they can do cap and trade like Quebec has and Ontario had, but got rid of. And under the regulations, there's prescriptive ones that say, you know, got to get this technology. And there's ones that are more flexible. And I'm going to talk about the flexible ones later. So this is the schema. This is where government has, and later when I'm going to say, how do we identify climate sincere politicians? This is the schema you want to use. So what are the basics of these compulsory? And if I'm on the compulsory side of the diagram, so you notice it said must have carbon pricing and or regulations to drive decarbonization. So if you read this as saying you must have carbon pricing, you're misreading that sentence. Note the and or. Carbon pricing is not essential. If it's too difficult politically, it can be replaced with regulations. And if the flexible regulations can mimic carbon pricing, and they can, then it might be, you know, not significantly more costly and perhaps easier politically. And therefore regulations can and often do play a key role in leading jurisdictions. And my next slide, oh no, I'm going to show you what I mean by flexible regulations. I'm going to go quick on this because we can come back to this in questions because it can take a while. What they do is they mimic the cost of carbon pricing, but they don't pick technology winners. And they let the sellers of whatever it is, electricity, cars, energy for transport, they let them trade among themselves so that the ones who can do it most cheaply do the reductions, and others for whom it's expensive pay them for that. An example is what 30 states in the United States have, a renewable portfolio standard in which all electricity sellers have to achieve a minimum percentage of electricity from renewables or buy credits from firms who surpass that minimum percentage. Like a firm that has a wind farm is going to be beyond 50%, it'll be 100% renewable, and so it'll have surplus credits to sell. And likewise, a zero emission standard, which California has and British Columbia and Quebec, all vehicle sellers achieve a minimum percentage ZEVs or buy credits from firms who surpass the minimum, such as Tesla. So that's a flexible regulation. And California is an example. If you look at California's policies, people say, oh, they've got cap and trade, so they must be, you know, using carbon pricing. Well, of the reductions estimated by the California Air Resources Board from its portfolio policies, carbon pricing, the cap and trade part is about 15% of the total, and the rest is coming from those flexible regulations. And I can make pie charts like this for all of Canada, for the province of British Columbia. I once did one for Alberta that showed that poor Rachel Notley had a bullseye on her back because of her carbon tax, and it looked to do about 5% of the reductions compared to her coal phase out, her methane regs, her industrial policy, all the other policies she was doing. And all everyone talked about in Alberta was the carbon tax, and it helped to unite political forces to defeat her. So there we go. The simple path from both an actions point of view and the policies that drive the actions. Now you are empowered. You know what that is. And then the rest of the book is devoted to helping you navigate through people who want to divert you from that simple, or even yourself. And it might not be a willful thing. It might well be unconscious. So we've had experts telling us a coordinated global effort won't happen voluntarily. Electricity and transportation are achievable and globally critical. And renewables won't beat fossil fuels without a carbon price or a regulation. And if we have flexible regulations, then carbon pricing, if it's too difficult, we can do those. So we've known this. So what's holding back global decarbonization? The first is deliberate delusions. And I think that this audience probably knows all about these, where people have said the climate science is uncertain, we have to do this particular project for the economy, we'll wait for innovation, and so on. These are deliberate. They're like the Upton Sinclair quote. They're based usually on self-interest and trying to delude other people. The second one, though, and now I'm starting to venture into the area of those who actually are climate concerned and are sincere, And it's what I'm calling rigid pro and con views. And this is what takes us back to my opening comments about the debate yourself game. Right? So if we hold these pro and con views and we haven't explored them and been willing to look at the alternative sides, whether it's nuclear power, large hydro, biofuels, carbon capture and storage, or the policy I just talked about, carbon taxes, having strong positions on these in all contexts. So people say to me, are you for nuclear power? And I'll say, I don't know. Depends where. It depends what you're talking about. Should so-and-so shut down all their nuclear plants tomorrow? Maybe not. So it really depends. And so why not allow yourself to really know both sides of the arguments? Should we have biofuels? Maybe part of the world, we should implement them. And of course, the fossil fuel industry has loved this rigidity. And because, as that famous saying is, it's basically allowing perfection to be the enemy of good. Now, I think I've included a slide here. Oh, yes. This is my effort 15 years ago, 16, 17 years ago. I wrote a book called Sustainable Fossil Fuels because it was obvious that people were talking peak oil, peak natural gas, and that, oh, good, we didn't need to act on greenhouse gas reduction. And then because, we were going to run out of fossil fuels anyway. And then those people who did want us to act quickly on climate said, whatever we do, we have to stop using fossil fuels completely. You can never use them with carbon capture and storage. So that's a zero emission way of producing electricity or hydrogen. And so I thought, this is crazy. We're basically telling people in Alberta or Texas or Saudi Arabia that we have to annihilate their economy in order to solve this problem. To me, it was so obvious, knowing human bias without having read a lot of psychology, how people would react to that. They would have a lot of those deliberate delusions. They would not believe the science, or many of them wouldn't. And because of that, they would fight back and slow down our effort instead of saying, hey, you're part of the solution. So it's kind of interesting now, even talking about Canada's federal hydrogen strategy and so on. I said to the minister not that long ago, federally, I said, oh, you're following the roadmap I did 17 years ago. It's too bad we delayed. It's a way of saying to people, oh, if we're going to solve this, we're going to help you be part of the solution. So the other is wishful thinking bias. We'll think that we have biases that will hinder or delay. One is energy efficiency investments save money, so we'll do energy efficiency. We have to stop burning coal, oil, and natural gas, not make a natural gas heated house more efficient or an oil heated house more efficient. Belief that renewables are out competing fossil fuels, I already talked about that. And belief that we can reduce emissions by things like offsets. So I have a chapter on that. Of course, the fossil fuel industry love those biases. Now, the big one, agenda hitching. Some people have hitched personal agendas, arguing that decarbonization requires behavioral change, social change, economic revolution in just 2 decades. And I'm pretty sure you would have heard all of those. We have to stop population growth, stop eating meat, stop flying planes, driving cars, stop all economic growth, achieve complete global equity and justice, abolish capitalism. So let's be clear. These goals are certainly, some of them are desirable, and certainly we need to improve on capitalism. We need the right kind of economic growth if there's going to be any economic growth. Our cities are more livable if there's less car driving. We should be flying planes less for a whole bunch of reasons, and eating less meat or none, and so on. These are all important things, but they also, people who have those, who are advocates of these things, hitch them in. And maybe some of you, we can have a debate about this later. We'll say, oh, he's crazy. Of course we have to stop eating meat or we won't solve climate change. Well, I'll argue with the evidence doesn't show that. And I would argue that the experts, when I go through this and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, would agree. That's where I get this information from. So of course, the fossil fuel industry, though, loves agenda hitching because it leads to that quote I had from Lisa's song about how complicated it is. And so, it allows the insincere politician to say, it's a really big problem. There isn't any, why get me to put on a carbon price or regulation? Everybody has to act. And that's really been the case for the last 3 decades. I've been in the meeting room with politicians and sometimes environmental climate advocates, and the advocates talked about how complicated it was and the politician loved it. And then what else is holding us back. It's climate insincere politicians. Now, this is a fun photo from that people have enjoyed in Canada. Soon some of the characters are leaving as Andrew Scheer is no longer there. But I'm not going to talk a lot about that. I'm going to talk instead about the task of finding and supporting the climate sincere politicians. What are they? Well, they don't deliberately confuse actions and policies. So in the last election, Andrew Scheer said, we don't believe in carbon pricing. We believe in innovation. Okay, that's a deliberate confusion. I know that his advisors would have told him you can't have innovation without carbon pricing or regulations, because there's also innovation going on making fossil fuels cheaper all the time. So you need the innovations to be biased away from fossil fuels. You need the policies. He's not telling the truth there. Or they're even telling you untruths about the compulsory policies that they especially, let's say the carbon price federally hurts poor people. I'm sorry, but I heard Erin O'Toole say that the other day, and it's not true. None of the economists who are analyzing it find that at all, none of the independent analysts. They'll implement compulsory policies in domestic electricity and transportation, right? So that's what we should see happening. And they'll also, for the big emitters, so we know that that's more difficult because of the trade constraints, right? That they're under competition, and we could have leakage of industry to the developing, to other countries that don't, to laggard countries that don't have to be developing. And so we need a mix of sort of price and subsidies to drive innovation and low-cost decarbonization in these sectors. And then finally, because it's a global problem and because we won't reach this voluntary global agreement, we need individual countries to show leadership in multi-country efforts like the Powering Past Coal initiative that Canada and the UK started to phase in Paris in 2015. Is now an international movement to phase out, to get other countries to commit to phasing out coal. We also need to start committing to carbon tariffs so that the laggard countries are incentivized. And that might be climate clubs, like groups of countries who are willing to do that. And the Europeans are pushing in that direction, thank goodness, finally. And Canada now has at least talked about joining up with that. And I wouldn't be surprised if the Biden administration does as well. So what is my, I'm on my last couple of slides, so we're good in terms of timing. And now I'm shifting to that final question. And in the intro, it was already said that I've been an activist myself. It's not something that I've done through most of my career, but my students helped me to set up this kind of flow chart to help us figure out how to behave as citizens depending on the situation. And that's going to help you understand why in most of my life I have not done civil disobedience, but I did at a particular time. So let's just start here. You're a climate concerned citizen and you're trying to figure out what's your strategy here. So first, does the politician seem sincere? No. Well, we'll get there later. But if they are, do they have targets? No. But if they do, remember, as I said earlier, that's still not good enough. In fact, that's a good ruse. Like, oh, I've got targets. We got to make sure that they're linked to policies. So that would be good. But then what if the policies are sort of the non-compulsory ones and that's about it? So those policies have to be pricing and regulations, and they're easy to identify. It's a carbon price, it's cap and trade, or it's a regulation where experts say that regulation is going to increase, it's going to decrease emissions by causing the phase out of coal burning, oil burning, or natural gas burning. And so finally, are the pricing and regulations rising in stringency? So a rising carbon price and a tightening regulation, a zero emission vehicle mandate that says by this date, we're not selling any more gasoline vehicles. And if that's the case, then you campaign for and fund that politician. But if it's not the case, you're going to have to be more active. And so that's the kind of choices that you make. And then you have to, of course, see if it's working at all. And if it isn't, then you can look and see. And if it isn't, you're in this loop of continuing that kind of action. So, and that's a part in the book. And there's a lot of description around that. So in summary, to end off my talk, the simple path to climate success, we have to simplify. We have to work to elect and support climate sincere politicians. They have to be implementing flex regs and or carbon pricing. They have to be making alliances for global coal and gas phase out and carbon taxes and carbon tariffs, I should say. And also then when your government is doing those kind of things, it makes it possible for you as an individual to get an electric car because your electricity system is zero emission and electric cars are now available. They're expensive, but there's an active secondhand market now, or you can do what I did and take advantage of low interest rates and buy it on time. So I'm making payments on mine and convert our houses. I mean, about 40% of Canadians building heat is electricity already. And we need that to be even greater, or some combination of biogas and so on. So, but how do we get those climate sincere politicians? You know, and that's where I get to this citizen activism as a moral obligation as my final slides. Now, I'm very privileged because I'm an expert. I'm able to appear before parliamentary committees. I've appeared before the European Parliament. This is me appearing on Capitol Hill in Washington before the a US congressional committee. And so I'm very lucky with that sense. But at the same time, when I know and see what's going on, I pay heed to quotes from people like Bill McKibben, who will say, planet Earth is miles outside its comfort zone, and how many will go beyond ours? And so while I've been lucky, there was a period when I have to say the Harper government was in power federally, and Canada was a very disappointing player in this global challenge. And I happened to be in British Columbia, where we had a government of Christy Clark that was basically just stagnant in terms of climate. And so other activists I knew convinced me to use my name as a former chair of the Utilities Commission and member of the Royal Society of Canada to also protest. And in this case, it was to block a coal train. And so, yes, I was arrested, and this is me in handcuffs, just being put in the paddy wagon. And the fun part is, why am I smiling? The police officer, the gentle police officers, just said to me, we have to stop coal. So anyway, it was fun to see that. And what is my point? What influence? Well, Greta Thunberg is an inspiration to all of us, and reminds me of the quote of Margaret Mead, that never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. And it's the only thing that really ever has. And that's why I'm also very pleased to speak to a group like yours of citizens engaged. And so, and I'll end with a final quote, that those who have the privilege to know have the duty to act, from Albert Einstein. So thank you very much for your attention. And I look forward to our questions, and just point out at the bottom that you can see videos of some of the concepts in the book at markjaccard.com. You can order the book, and also you can follow me on Twitter, where I don't tweet a lot, but I try to tweet substance that can be helpful for climate concerned citizens. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mark.
All right. So Mark, last December, the federal government announced an enhanced policy framework, and they proclaimed that Canada's on a path to meet its 2030 Paris target emissions, and that they have the building blocks in place to get to net zero by 2050. So my question to you is, does the federal government have, in fact, a credible plan to meet the targets, and the right current mix of proposed policies, assuming they follow through, and do they have the building blocks to get to net zero in 2050? So is their plan credible?
Thank you. And I'm really glad for that question. And to make my talk fit into our time frame, I excluded a slide in which I run through, in fact, can I screen share again? Because I think the slide is still there. Let's just see.
The last one, I think.
Let's just, here we go. Yeah, so I excluded this slide. It's after my final one. And so a couple of things. Before I even get you to look at this, don't look. The federal government, so Canada's tricky, right? Because we're a federation. And in my view, we have no global government. Remember, I showed that on a slide. And so even then, our humanity's odds are not good. And that's why we've been failing. we don't have a global government, and we can't seem to do global diplomacy for this kind of a issue. We can't get enough countries to be willing to do tariffs and, and not just carrots, but sticks to get us there. Imagine then taking that down to the level where one country can't even make international commitments because it would have to get all of its provincial governments to buy in. And we know from the third myth I talked about that politics goes up and down. Climate insincere politicians get elected. They're not telling the truth about their targets. And so it's impossible to have all of Canada always on the same page. Trudeau sort of started with that in 2015, but had to finally face reality, and we got the court case. Thank goodness the court case said, yes, your federal government has some backstop authority to make sure we hit our target. So that's the first thing. We now know that they have the constitutional authority to do carbon pricing and or regulations, although some of these things are always to challenge. So then, are they implementing them? And yes, they are. Like, our government since 2015 is, I'm on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and we're always working to compare what governments are looking at their policies. And when I'm in these meetings over the last few years, over the last year by Zoom, people sort of want to give me credit. They say, wow, your government is doing all these things. We just wish the government of Australia or France or wherever were doing that. So, and I don't take credit for anything because I wouldn't deserve the credit, but I say, yeah, like right now, that's the way it is. That can change. Governments change, court rulings change. But as it stands right now, we have a government that is doing carbon pricing. And I and others modeled a long time ago and said to hit the Paris target in 2030, that carbon price has to rise to close to $200. Now, the federal government has committed to, if it stays in power, to continuing the price rise right through to $170 in 2030. Globally, for within Canada, that is very impressive. It's also, though, working with our large industry in the ways that I talked about, and it's doing a carbon pricing system there, but it's also making sure that it doesn't dramatically increase cost of production. So there's going to have to be some financial support, which we've seen from Scandinavian countries for their heavy industry. And then we're developing other regulations in transportation, methane regulations. The last I've seen, and the government's going to come out, there's a budget coming up and so on. They are very close to having a package that would achieve the Paris target. And one of the top independent modeling groups in the country, Navius, modeled the federal plan back in December and showed that it came under various scenarios, it came close to hitting the Paris target. And I can tell you, because I've done modeling under the Harper government, for the C.D. Howe Institute, under the Chrétien government, and no federal government in Canada has been climate sincere until the Trudeau government. None of their policies would have come close to hitting targets like the Kyoto target, the Kyoto target for 2010, the 2020 target, and now the 2030 target.
The first one would be around the Supreme Court recent decision about the constitutionality, which you just touched on. But their question really is more about, does the federal government have policy levers to bring provinces on board who are still going to oppose or try to sort of fiddle with the way in which the Supreme Court decision was handed down in order to kind of avoid the inevitable in terms of either pricing or regulations?
So good question, and I've partly answered that, and I'll also try to give shorter answers from now on. But so the answer is yes, but there's always wiggle room, right? So I'll just give you an example. In electricity, like the federal government had they have a regulation under CEPA, the Canadian Environmental Protection Act, and CO2 is defined as a pollutant. So Stephen Harper put in a regulation on electricity, on coal, that affected coal plants across the country. It was just that it was a regulation that took forever to have the reductions. The Liberals have taken that and changed the sort of the CO2 per kilowatt hour carbon emissions intensity of that, and now are phasing out coal plants with doing that. And it looks like it's happening across the country. So in other words, other provinces, well, it really is affecting Alberta, Saskatchewan, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, and they're going along with that. The federal government now needs to make that even tighter because we can't just build natural gas plants as the solution. So there's still debate. You know, if you're the federal government, you're still trying to have some provincial allies. You can't just do it with British Columbia alone and Quebec alone. And that was electricity. In transport, the federal government has the carbon price. And then again, there's wiggle room though. So New Brunswick said, okay, you know, but we're going to take the carbon, we're going to develop our own policy. So instead of the federal government getting the carbon tax revenue, we'll collect the revenue and we're going to use the money to lower sales tax on fuels. And so that'll help so that gasoline prices won't go up, which is the signal you need to make it, you know, economic for more people to buy cars and so on, to buy electric cars. So this is just a couple of examples of there's still a game in play here. It's not, the Supreme Court decision doesn't solve everything. But I would argue that yes, the federal government is using examples from electricity and in transportation, they have a clean fuel regulation. So even if a province is doing something like playing games with the pricing of gasoline, there's a flexible regulation called the Clean Fuel Standard that the federal government intends to implement, which would be nationwide. And British Columbia already has that policy, as does California, and as does several other US states. So the federal government, you know, the court case was about carbon pricing. The federal government still has regulatory authorities that have not been defeated in court. And so I think we're still good. And but this court case was really important. So I'm much more optimistic now.
Great, thanks. A quick question. Can you give an example of a flexible regulation, of a flex reg?
Yeah. So if I, in some of my slides, not the ones I brought today, I'll have a map of the United States, and it shows that some people despair. They'll say, well, the United States doesn't have a price on carbon. And quite frankly, leading economists in the US have been saying for 30 years, just put a price on carbon. You know, Canada's got one now and so on. And that's important. We call that an explicit carbon price. But if you put in a flexible regulation, it even creates an implicit carbon price. So 30 states or something like that in the US have a requirement that, let's say right now they were at 20% of electricity. Texas was at like 5% of when it first put in its renewable portfolio standard. So it's a portfolio generating electricity, and they have to be renewable. The renewable portfolio standard brought in under when George Bush, the second, was the governor of Texas a long time ago. It said a minimum percentage of electricity, maybe 5%, should be generated from renewables, and wind won most of the economic competitions. And then it would say, oh, and in 5 years it needs to be 10%, and in another 5 years it needs to be 20%. So that's a requirement. Now, the people who are producing electricity with wind therefore have credits that they can sell to the coal plant. And so the coal plant, because the owner of a bunch of coal plants, if they don't own any renewables, they need to buy credits from the renewables. And that helps to subsidize someone putting in the wind turbine. And at the end of the day, Texas, there was so much wind in the system now that it's making it hard for the coal plants to still operate. And it helps to explain why coal plants kept shutting down and coal plant production declining, even when Donald Trump said he didn't want that to happen. But that's because at least 30 US states have renewable portfolio standards. So that's a flexible, and it's a flexible regulation because it doesn't say you have to do wind. It says it could be wind or solar or whatever. And it doesn't say that every producer of electricity has to hit that percentage. It just has to be the total for the whole market. And so people can trade, so those who can do it more cheaply. That's why we call it a flexible regulation. And guess what? The trading price of the credits, people like me can back out, and we do, and calculate what that means as a price per ton of CO2. In other words, we can compare it to a carbon price. It's an implicit carbon price instead of an explicit carbon price. I hope that helps.
Yeah, that's good. And so another this kind of ties in a way, this question about the Trans Mountain Pipeline and the recent study from Simon Fraser predicting the project will lead to $12 billion in losses. So there's a financial aspect to that, but of course there's the issue about continuing to ship fossil fuels, which some people would say have to be stopped immediately. So do you have any comments on the study or on how the federal government might act on the Trans Mountain going forward as this study has come out?
Yes. So, yeah, it is fun. A lot of people have asked me if I produced that study. How many energy economists are there at Simon Fraser University? I'm the director of the School of Resource and Environmental Management, which is interdisciplinary. We have economists, ecologists, planners, and Dr. Tom Gunton, a longtime colleague of mine, was the head of that study, and I wasn't involved in it at all. But he has made a name for himself in studying mega projects and how they have cost overruns from way back to what was called Northeast Coal in British Columbia 30 years ago. And so, he's been looking at this project and sort of anticipating cost overruns. My position on Trans Mountain, and again, in a longer slide set that I have, I started out with a slide of Justin Trudeau, and then there's a bunch, and is he climate sincere or not? And then there's a photo of Elizabeth May and people protest in a demonstration with a sign that climate sincere politicians don't build oil pipelines. And so, and even in British Columbia, among the environmentalists I know, they're just outraged by this. And this is where I like to challenge people on the whole pro and con side. And I'll tell you why. So first of all, at the end of the day, as a global energy economist, I know that what Canada does on the supply side to produce more oil or more natural gas or coal won't matter. What matters is the demand for oil, coal, and natural gas. And that's why my talk was all about how we globalize this effort of phasing out coal, of phasing out oil, of phasing out natural gas. It has to be a global effort. And guess what? When we succeed, and enough countries are pushing on this, working together, then the demand for oil will fall. And we have to succeed. We have to have transportation systems that aren't burning oil. And when we do that, the demand for oil falls, and the highest cost production phases out first. And when I go to Alberta and talk to my, I'm speaking there over the last 25 years, I get a lot of agreement from people. They're like, yeah, we know we're the high cost producer in the world. Thank goodness the demand for oil keeps rising, and it's really rising in the developing world. And so we have a good reason to be expanding our production. And also we want to build pipelines because at certain times we get a terrible price, especially if we have to send our oil through the United States. So it isn't about the total demand for oil is the only reason to build a pipeline. It's also about access to markets where you can get a better price. Now, would I build that pipeline? No, I'm dead set against that pipeline. But I'm not the Prime Minister of Canada who has to make really interesting, difficult choices, strategic choices about will there be a national meltdown if I don't build this pipeline? Will I have one region that becomes so obsessed with its grievances against the central government that the whole country will be absorbed in a struggle about independence from one region or just a huge grievance? And that will mean that our climate efforts will fall away, because I've seen that happen. I've seen the second Quebec referendum when the Chrétien government dropped all climate efforts, which looked like we're going to go fast, and all of Canada became absorbed in another national identity crisis or crisis of staying together. So I don't know. I am just trying to give you a reason to think about carefully, I hope, for why a federal government might say, you know what, build the darn pipeline, and then let's tell Alberta, oil consumption in Alberta is going down because we're phasing out, coal's going down. We're keeping our coal plant phase out. We're going to do the clean fuel standard and a rising carbon price. And so oil demand in Canada is going to go down as part of a global effort. But for now, and so we really don't think you should be expanding oil production. We also might want to help you convert your resources into hydrogen and electricity, because that could be part of the future. So I understand the realpolitik, I believe, of trying to make something like this, of allowing or supporting this pipeline. But I'm hoping that all of you would consider why a federal government would do that, even if you don't agree. It's fine to disagree.
So maybe this next question is kind of an extension of that, your comment, and that is the question about a sufficient sense of urgency. So your book sets out sort of the strategy guide for climate concerned Canadians, as well as key sectors and actions that we have to take. But timelines and urgency are not sort of part of the narrative of the book. So assuming we can eventually decarbonize, the question is, can we get there in time? That's the question from the chat. And does the federal government have a sufficient sense of urgency? So it's not about the plan, it's about the timing.
Yes, absolutely. And so my book is very much about urgency. So my book is about, oh my goodness, what's the simple path? Phase out coal burning, oil burning, natural gas. Human equity is a struggle, a century struggle. Never give up on that struggle. I feel that I've devoted much of my life to that, and my kids will, and my parents did. But we need to phase out the burning of fossil fuels. And that's why the book is all about, think about what is the essential that we have to do, and be strategic and move fast on that. So don't allow yourself the indulgence of, oh, you know, I don't really care if I keep the Liberals in power federally. I'm angry with them, and even in a riding I'm in where my vote will just ensure that an insincere government would get elected, I'm still going to punish them because of this pipeline. If you're thinking about urgency, you can't afford that. You've got a government in there right now that has the most rapidly rising carbon price in the world. And they're committed to it. And they're going to have to run an election on it. And they could well lose that election. So that is urgent. And the coal plant phase out, I mean, this is amazing. So this is to happen by 2030. It's a cost to our economy. So I definitely think the urgency's there. Where can we go fast? So you completely decarbonize electricity as fast as you can. Oh, federal government's on that path. Second, we need to decarbonize transportation as fast as possible, right? You heard my talk. Federal government, in my view, is not going fast enough on that, but they're close. So I think they should copy Quebec and British Columbia and have a zero emission vehicle standard. I'm on the climate policy advisory group in British Columbia, and we're having big debates about the zero emission vehicle standard, because it only gets the zero, it only says you can no longer sell a gasoline car in 2040. We want that pushed, some of us want that pushed up to 2030. And I know the government's listening, it's nervous, and even faster. The Norwegians are basically going to phase everything out by 2025. And I'm arguing we need a federal government that does that as well. So there's debates going on in policy. It's still not, there's a great urgency with this government, but it's the policy process is never super fast, but it's gone quite fast. Like the announcement, I'm surprised people aren't more, oh my goodness, they announced that the carbon price will get to $170. Nobody else does that. That's urgent.
Great. Let's do a little more international discussion here and go to Biden and his convening of the Leaders Summit on April, I think, 22nd, 23rd, billed as a key milestone on the road to COP26. And do you have any expectations on what might come out of this Leaders Summit? You've had some experience with some of these folks.
Yeah, so this is all speculative, and I want to be careful that I'm not just guilty of wishful thinking bias, which I've been telling you all about. But here's my wishful thought: so just think, Biden it's really unlikely that we're going to have a national carbon price in the United States this next 4 years of the Biden administration, because he needs a lot of support. He needs more than just 50 votes or 51 votes in the Senate to pull that off. So what's he going to end up doing? He's going to do what Obama did, which is he's going to do regulations in electricity to accelerate the phase out of coal plants. He's going to copy Canada. He's going to tighten, if you tighten vehicle efficiency regulations, you actually cause, thank goodness, you know, he's talking energy efficiency, but you cause fuel switching, because electric motors are way more efficient than, and hydrogen fuel cells are way more efficient than the internal combustion engine. So you can actually decarbonize your transportation system by just using what we call in the United States the CAFE standards, the corporate average fuel economy standards. So domestically, Biden will be doing that. But how does he get sort of the international action happening? On the one hand, I do see him starting to look for linkages and using climate as a way to get some agreement with China. And if you'll remember, Obama did that. So before the Paris Agreement, about a year before that, China came up with what shocked everyone and made me very optimistic at the time, and said, you know, we're still going to have our emissions rise a bit, but then they're going to fall. And here's all the things we're doing to decarbonize our system. Well, since then, 5 years, 6 years later, the Chinese have gotten even more aggressive. And so, and of course, we know the Europeans are very aggressive. So just think of this: China, Europe, North America, so Canada, US. That's a great possibility for some really ambitious agreements. But those don't always mean a lot unless the tariffs are coming on. And I don't know if they would talk about that at all. But I know Biden has been talking about tariffs, and I know that that's part of even, it helps with the sort of America first idea, which I don't think will hurt Canada at all, but it'll be this idea that, and I don't think it'll hurt China that much. I think it'll be something where it means India, you can't go on this development path. You can't just go on the fossil fuel path. Indonesia and all, Tanzania, Kenya, all of these countries, I'm hoping that what happens when Biden convenes people is that they're really thinking globally. And so they will talk about financial support for those countries as well. It won't be enough, and therefore you need carrot and stick. And I'm whether that'll come out then, I don't know, but that'll be something they'll be talking about, I think.
Okay. There's a interesting question that's Ontario based, and that has to do with the Ontario government having recently purchased natural gas plants, which they own 50% of, and bought the other 50% from the private sector. So they're running these 5 natural gas plants, which are supposedly purchased so that they can replace the electricity production when the nuclear power plants are being refurbished. But they see this obviously as part of the energy mix within Ontario. And the question is whether you can advise on how to advocate around this kind of issue when there were alternatives such as Quebec hydropower.
Absolutely. And this is something I'm working on, and with different people, I can't say exactly who or what, but I talked about, and I haven't followed Ontario very closely. In fact, what you just told me about the purchase of those plants was news to me. But I mentioned this when I talked about the coal phase out starting in 2015, but actually a Harper federal regulation under SEPA earlier. It says this much CO2 per kilowatt hour. So guess what? That amount, you could look at that and say, oh, okay, we could put carbon capture and storage and keep the coal plants. Saskatchewan has a plant like that. Or we'll stop running the coal plant, but we'll convert it to natural gas, and it'll be a base load plant. It'll run a lot. And you've seen a little bit of this in Ontario. You phased out your coal plants, which was wonderful. But for me, there was a little too much, a little too much natural gas being built. And then I don't have the data for how often it's run. I've looked at this at various times over the last few years. I'm not up to date, so I want to be careful. But the point is, you don't want many of those natural gas plants to be running a lot. You want them there to back up wind and solar and your other non-dispatchable or variable renewables. And then I think natural gas has a real role, because these plants will sit there and they'll only operate maybe 10% of the year. And because of that, your CO2 per kilowatt hour will be at a really nice low level. So the federal government, and it's not easy though, because they don't want to get unpopular with different provinces, but I'm hoping that, over the next couple of years, they change the CO2 per kilowatt hour reg so that it not only does it prevent you from building a coal plant or continuing to operate, it would really make it difficult for your system to have very many natural gas plants that were running base load. So running 80% of the year or 90% of the year of the hours in the year, as opposed to 10%. But natural gas plants as a backup and a support, a complement to zero emission intermittent sources of electricity, and wind and solar really are the biggies, is fine. And of course, in Canada, though, we also have, as you mentioned, we have these huge, we have these provinces that are almost entirely hydropower, like BC, Manitoba, Quebec, and Labrador, and so it would be really good to improve our interties. And the federal government has a role it can play there as well. So and in British Columbia, we're looking at sort of the connection between Alberta and BC as one example, but certainly Ontario connecting more in with Quebec makes sense. But again, I'm not up to date on the exact specifics of that.
That's great. Thanks. That's really helpful. There's a couple questions that relate to politicians, one of your favorite subjects. So let me kind of combine those, or ask both of them. One is how can we persuade politicians, local to federal, that this is not a partisan issue and that it needs action now. So that's the first one. The second one is, do you have any specific advice on what can be done to persuade the Conservative Party to take this issue seriously? At some point, they may win, and yet last month, a majority of delegates, of course, denied climate change was even a problem. So how do we get that party to come on board in case they end up with power?
Wonderful question. Wonderful question. And I have to be careful what I say. So I have to be careful because, well, I just think that so first of all, just the point that someone said, like, can we get it nonpartisan? I just want to say that in France today, action on climate is nonpartisan. Like, it doesn't identify different political groups. I would say it's probably the same in the UK. It's the same in Scandinavia. It's the same in California. So there are places in the world where it is no longer a partisan issue. People can still argue about policy. Is it this price? Is it the carbon price, or regulation, or price this way or that way? And I don't care. Like I've always said, I never want to get in arguments about this is the right way to do it. I just know it has to be a compulsory policy, and independent people have to show you'll actually hit your target with the stringencies of that policy. So can Canada have sincere climate action be basically sort of nonpartisan anymore? And I don't have a crystal ball, but I hear that there's just wonderful struggle going on inside the Conservative Party right now. And I think and so I think me and you and everyone needs to help with that. And you help in different ways, of course. You help in your local community with the conservative politicians or conservative-oriented neighbors you have. I mean, most Canadian Conservatives, their values are very similar to Canadian Liberals or even NDP. I mean, that's the beauty of Canada, in my view. And it's so we can be nonpartisan in lots of important social decisions and issues. And of course, that's the struggle for the federal Conservatives who would like to govern for all of Canada. And so even on the social conservative side, Stephen Harper knew, and they know they have to be, and Erin O'Toole knows they have to be very careful of not having a socially conservative agenda. on abortion or rights for various types of orientation, sexual orientation. And so, without saying too much, I think I don't care that the federal conservatives want to get rid of a carbon tax. I think the important thing is, what are they saying? What will they say will replace it? And can independent modelers confirm that in fact they would hit the Paris target, or they would be as climate sincere? And so all I can say is push hard on this in any way you can think how, because I think there is some kind of struggle there. And I don't know Aaron O'Toole, but he wants to govern. He'd like to be prime minister. So he has to, so no matter who he is, he has to think about this intelligently, and has to, and obviously the liberals, like, when I was shocked when the liberals put in that price, because I called that the 905 gamble. It was like, okay, we know that this rising carbon tax is going to cost us some votes in the 905, but some marginal votes that are swing votes. But maybe it'll gain us some swing votes, among the millennials that are coming in. So I don't have any insight into the political calculus, but whatever it is, they've thrown down the gauntlet to the Conservative Party, and I think we're in an exciting time here, and I'm full of hope, and I'm doing what I can, and I encourage everyone to do what they can to speak to conservatives and help them through this. And the fact that the majority of delegates maybe still voted about climate doesn't really matter to me. The whole theme of my book is, and I even have a chapter on smoking. We act on these things when just enough people can affect the political calculus, not when they're, I have to talk every climate denier into this. It's not like that, thank goodness.
Mark, thank you. We're getting to the end where we have to move on to the rest of our agenda, but your responses to these questions have been fabulous and really helpful, understanding both your thesis and where you're coming from, and all the experience and work that you've put into this over the years. So I'm just incredibly grateful that you've spent time with us, because it's a big help for those of us who are trying to struggle day to day, try to make our voices heard, and to get other people to consider what needs to be done for a sustainable future. So I really appreciate this. And of course, having you as our anniversary guest is even better from our point of view. So thank you for that.
Well,
And
I want to say that I see there are about 145 participants, and so I'm very impressed at your ability to bring together such a large group of people. And I'm inspired by the kinds of questions that are coming out of this group. So you yourselves are a very inspiring group, and I commend you, and you're what helps to make Canada a great country. Your role is essential. And so I'm thrilled to have been invited to have done this, and it's exceeded expectations. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And for all the participants, don't forget to get a copy of the book. You can get it from the library, you can buy it, you can get it online. It's really an important read that I think all of us need to spend some time thinking about, because it's got some great directions for us to take, both as a club and as citizens in this country.